What happens after we die? This question has echoed in every age, every culture, every human heart. We live knowing that death is certain, and yet its meaning, its texture, and its continuation, if any, remain among the greatest mysteries of existence. For some, death marks an absolute ending. For others, it is a passage, a doorway into another state of being. But across the world, humans have rarely treated death as chaos. They have envisioned it as a journey, often with maps, guides, and instructions meant to help the departing soul. Two traditions, in particular, created some of the most detailed cartographies of the afterlife: the ancient Egyptians and the Tibetan Buddhists. The Egyptians gave us the Book of the Dead, or more accurately, the Book of Coming Forth by Day, a collection of spells and prayers meant to guide the deceased through the underworld to eternal life. The Tibetans developed the Bardo Thödol, known popularly as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which described the stages of consciousness between death and rebirth. Separated by thousands of miles and millennia, these traditions nonetheless share something remarkable: a belief that death is structured, that it can be navigated, and that preparation in life determines the outcome beyond it. Today we will investigate these two traditions in depth. We'll enter the tombs and temples of ancient Egypt to see how their priests and scribes prepared souls for judgment and eternal life. Then we'll journey into the mountains of Tibet, where lamas whispered guiding words into the ears of the dying, helping consciousness recognize its own nature in the transition between lives. The Egyptians externalized the afterlife as a cosmic trial before divine judges. The Tibetans internalized it as the mind confronting its own visions and projections. One mapped the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, in papyrus and stone. The other mapped the mind's dissolutions and visions in spoken words and meditation. Both, however, insisted on one truth: death is not the end of consciousness. It is a passage, and passages can be prepared for. So as we open this investigation, we begin with the question that has haunted humanity since its beginning: what happens after death? And perhaps more importantly, how do we prepare for it? Welcome to the Emerald Codex. If you want more deep investigations into ancient wisdom and hidden knowledge, subscribe. Thanks for supporting this work. In this episode, Egypt is our primary investigation. We'll explore its funerary religion, its conception of the soul, and the ritual technologies it developed to navigate the afterlife. For Egypt, the afterlife was not metaphor. It was a structured reality, as real as the Nile and as ordered as the rising of the sun. Our complementary tradition will be Tibetan Buddhism. Emerging from an entirely different worldview, it nonetheless created another kind of map, one that described consciousness moving through bardos, in between states, after death. Where Egypt spoke of Osiris and Mayat, Tibet spoke of luminosity, peaceful deities, and wrathful projections of the mind. We will not try to flatten these approaches into one universal doctrine. Each deserves to be seen in its full context. But by placing them side by side, we can notice the universal patterns that emerge: the insistence on guidance, the emphasis on preparation, and the conviction that consciousness continues. This is how we investigate: by walking deeply into traditions, listening carefully, and asking how their wisdom might still speak today. The Egyptian vision of the afterlife crystallized most fully during the New Kingdom period. Roughly 1550–1070 BCE, by this time, Egypt had already developed a complex funerary religion rooted in its older pyramid texts and coffin texts. The great temples at Karnak and Luxor connected the rhythms of life to cosmic cycles, while the Valley of the Kings became the monumental stage where afterlife preparations reached their height. The Egyptians lived in a world where order, Ma'at, was the foundation of existence. Just as the Nile flooded and receded in dependable cycles, so too did the sun die each evening and rise again each morning. Death was not an aberration. It was another phase in the eternal rhythm of dissolution and renewal. Their funerary practices sought to ensure that human beings, like the sun, could rise again, transfigured into a new state of existence. The Egyptians held a profoundly complex view of the human being. Unlike modern conceptions of the soul as a single essence, the Egyptians saw a person as made of multiple interrelated parts. The Ka, the vital essence; the Bai, the mobile personality; the Ren, or name, which anchored identity; the Shot, the shadow; and the Ak, the luminous, transfigured form one could become after death. When death came, these parts separated. The body lay in the tomb, preserved by mummification. The Ka required offerings to be sustained. The Ba could leave the tomb and travel. But for all these aspects to be reintegrated and transfigured into the Ak, the soul had to successfully navigate the afterlife. The central recognition was this: death was not the end of being. It was a dangerous journey, filled with obstacles, guardians, and judgments, which had to be overcome for the deceased to achieve eternal life. Without preparation, the soul could be lost or destroyed. With the right knowledge, passwords, spells, and truths, the soul could emerge victorious, reborn as an imperishable star in the sky. The most famous guide for this journey was what we call the Book of the Dead. More accurately, its Egyptian title was the Book of Coming Forth by Day. It was not one fixed book, but a customizable collection of spells written on papyrus, placed in tombs to accompany the deceased. Some versions contained only a few dozen spells. Others held nearly 200. The spells served different functions. Some instructed the deceased on how to transform into animals or birds to escape danger. Others provided the right words to speak when confronted by guardians. There were spells for avoiding decapitation, spells for remembering one's own name, spells for reuniting the Ba and Ka. Each was a tool in the arsenal of survival. Among these, Spell 125 became iconic: the weighing of the heart. In this ritual scene, the deceased's heart was placed on a scale opposite the feather of Mayat, the principle of cosmic order and truth. Thoth, the scribe of the gods, recorded the result. If the heart was heavy with wrongdoing, it was devoured by the monstrous Ammit, ending the journey forever. But if the heart balanced with the feather, the soul was declared Ma Keru, true of voice, and granted passage into the company of Osiris, Lord of the Dead. These texts were not abstract theology. They were ritual technology. Just as one packed food, tools, and weapons for a journey in life, one packed spells and images for the journey after death. The tomb itself became part of this toolkit. Painted walls depicted the journey through the Duat, with stars overhead and protective deities at every threshold. Coffins bore protective inscriptions. Amulets were placed on the body to guard the soul. Every detail of burial was oriented toward survival in the world beyond. This system was not restricted to kings and elites. Over time, versions of the Book of the Dead became available to nobles, officials, and eventually even common people who could afford papyrus copies. What mattered was not only wealth, but alignment with Ma'at. Egyptians believed that to live truthfully, to act with justice, to honor the gods, to treat others fairly, was itself preparation for the weighing of the heart. Ritual could guide the soul, but the life lived was the true foundation of the afterlife journey. Death rituals also bound communities together. Funerals, processions, and offerings to ancestors reinforced social order and continuity. Temples conducted rituals that linked the cycles of gods, nature, and human death into one seamless pattern. The Egyptian afterlife vision was not separate from society. It was its ultimate expression. Echoes of Egypt's vision still shape religious imagination today. The image of judgment after death, of deeds weighed, reverberates in Abrahamic traditions of heaven, hell, and divine trial. But beyond doctrine, the Egyptian view offers us a challenge. If your heart were placed on the scales today, would it be light? Would your life align with truth and balance? The Egyptian map reminds us that life and death are not separate. Living in harmony with truth is itself preparation for whatever lies beyond. And perhaps that is the enduring lesson, that to prepare for death is to live with integrity. 2 centuries and continents away, Tibet developed a very different but equally detailed map of death. The Bardo Thödol, often called the Tibetan Book of the Dead, emerged from Vajrayana Buddhist traditions. Compiled around the 14th century, it drew on centuries of Indian Tantric and Mahayana Buddhist teachings about consciousness and rebirth. The Bardo Thödol taught that after death, the consciousness of the deceased passes through a series of stages. First comes the bardo, of the moment of death, in which the mind encounters the clear light, a radiant, formless awareness that is the true nature of reality. If the deceased recognizes it, liberation is possible immediately. If not, the consciousness enters successive bardos where it encounters peaceful and wrathful deities. These beings are not external gods in the literal sense, but projections of the mind's own nature. Peaceful deities appear first, offering the chance to recognize one's true nature in serenity. If missed, wrathful forms appear, fierce and terrifying, representing the mind's unintegrated fears and desires. To recognize them as one's own projections is liberation. To fear them is to be driven into rebirth. Throughout this process, the living play a role. Monks or family members recite the Bardo Thödol to the dying or newly dead, reading instructions aloud, reminding the consciousness to recognize the clear light, to see visions as mind's own display, to avoid clinging in fear. The text itself is a guide, like a lantern held beside the soul. Comparing Egypt and Tibet reveals striking differences. One speaks of Osiris and scales, the other of luminosity and projections. And yet beneath these differences lies a shared recognition. Death is a transition, not an annihilation. It is structured, knowable, and can be prepared for. Both insisted on preparation. In Egypt, one prepared by aligning life with Ma'at and learning the spells of the Duat. In Tibet, one prepared by practicing meditation, cultivating recognition of the clear light, and familiarizing oneself with the bardos through ritual. Both traditions gave the dying words of guidance. In Egypt, written on papyrus placed in the tomb. In Tibet, spoken into the ear of the departing consciousness. Both imagined a landscape beyond death, where the unprepared risked destruction or rebirth, while the prepared could attain eternal life or liberation. For us today, these traditions remind us that death is not chaos. It is a process that reflects how we live. To live truthfully, or to live mindfully, is to prepare for dying well. Egypt and Tibet together invite us to see death not as an interruption, but as part of the continuum of consciousness. What do these two afterlife maps mean for us today? First, They remind us that cultures across time saw death as part of a rhythm. Egypt looked to the daily rising of the sun. Death and rebirth mirrored in the solar cycle. Tibet described dissolution and re-emergence of consciousness, echoing natural rhythms of expansion and contraction. Second, they show us that how we live shapes how we die. In Egypt, the heart carried the weight of one's deeds. In Tibet, the mind carried the imprints of one's practice. In both, one could not separate life from death. To prepare for death was to live consciously. Third, they reveal that death has always inspired humanity to create maps, to imagine the invisible. These maps may not be literal geographies, but they are true in another way. They chart the human encounter with mystery. Whether inscribed in papyrus or spoken in Himalayan caves, they tell us that consciousness is not extinguished. It moves, transforms, continues. Today, in modern contexts, these maps still speak. Near-death experiences echo Egyptian journeys and Tibetan visions, tunnels, lights, encounters, reviews of one's life. Psychology recognizes death anxiety as a central driver of human meaning-making. Neuroscience investigates how consciousness might persist or dissolve. And yet, the question remains open, just as it always has. What happens after death? Perhaps the enduring lesson is this: we cannot know with certainty, but we can prepare by living truthfully, by living mindfully, by facing the mystery with courage rather than avoidance. We participate in the same wisdom that Egypt and Tibet preserved. So we end this investigation not with answers, but with questions meant to linger. Why do humans across cultures create maps of the afterlife? What does this reveal about consciousness itself? Are these maps symbolic, literal, or both? How should we approach them today? If your heart were weighed against the feather of truth right now, how would it balance? If your mind entered the Bardos tonight, would you recognize the clear light, or would you be swept away by fear? How would your life change if you lived every day as though death were not an end, but a passage you are already preparing for? This is the work of the wisdom explorer, not to claim mastery, but to ask better questions, to look deeply into traditions, honor their depth, and allow their wisdom to open new questions for our own lives. This is the Emerald Codex. The investigation continues. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe for more.